directories that you can include, like a drawable directory, which will include bitmap graphics or XML graphics. And there's also a layout, so that you can actually add layout information in XML form, or you could also add menu definitions in a menu directory as well. And what's really neat about this set of directories is that not only can you localize strings, but also you can modify the name of the directory itself to give a hint to the OS of what sort of resources are included in there. So let's say that you create a game, for instance. And in that game, you have perhaps a variety of assets, a variety of graphics that you've created for different devices. Perhaps you've created some relatively low resolution graphics for the lower DPI devices, or perhaps you've created some really high resolution graphics for the larger screens or for the devices that have very, very high DPI available. And what you can do is very much in the style of a CSS selector, which you might remember from your talk in web development, can you actually add some properties to these folders, which are, again, not intentionally masked here, but you will hopefully see them when you download the PDF when it is posted on the website. But you can actually add CSS Style Selectors, or not. I don't want to say that. They're selectors in the style of sort of CSS, in the way that you can have these different selectors to target specific hardware devices or specific OS versions within each of these folders. So it becomes a little bit better. You don't have to release different versions of the same application, but you do, as you can imagine, have to create different versions of these assets for these different devices. And even though there's the argument, well, iOS is now fragmented between the iPad mini, and the iPhone, and the older versions, which did not have the Retina displays, and all these different things, it's really not quite as bad as we have here on Android. This is an attempt on Google's part to make it a little bit better. Now, these resources are, in fact, included within a file that's called an APK file. An APK file is, in fact, your Android application. And what's neat about this APK file is that you can actually download an APK file onto your computer. You can rename APK to .zip, unzip it, and see what the contents of that application actually is. It's kind of an interesting thing. You can actually see the resources that are available there. Anything that has not been compiled, it becomes very easy to look at. You can't look at the original source code, of course, because it's been compiled and then included within that zip file and packaged into this Android format. But you can, in fact, look at some of the resources that are available within that one file. So this is important to realize that we have this APK file, which is, in fact, this application that we want to ultimately create. Within that application, we have these resources. Again, you can create resources that are generic so that it would apply to all hardware devices, or you could even make them very specific by having multiple drawable directories for different resolutions or for different density screens. And you could create different strings directories for localization, international localization, and so on. But really, the heart of all of the Android applications comes from this one XML file called the Android manifest file. The Android manifest file basically tells the system, the Android system, when it is launching your application, what it should expect. What is the name of this application? What is the minimum version of the OS that I can run this application? What are the different screens called activities that might be available? What are the permissions that this app requires? Does it require phone access? Does it require access to my contacts? Does it require GPS access? All of those sorts of things. So the OS parses this information and will make a determination. The OS will actually decide whether or not it can install and run this application based on the limits that you set in this XML file and also the limits of the device. So perhaps the user rejects your permissions because you want to do all sorts of things on the user's device. You have your permissions are too loose, and they decide that that's actually not quite a good thing to do. Well, you can modify all of this information here in your own application towards that end. Now, one of the things that is really important to realize about this as well is that you'll notice that here we define a variety of things, but within this application, we actually have some components. Now, in this simplified version of the XML file, we have a single component called an activity. And this, when we start to talk about activities, this is where it really starts to deviate from the way that we would expect it to work if we only are familiar with iOS devices. In Android, it's really difficult for us to talk about an application as a single, all-enclosed app that runs entirely with your code. It is possible, for instance, if I am creating let's say that I want to create an application that perhaps uploads some photos from your phone up to the web. Perhaps I have a photo sharing service of some kind, and I want to be able to take your photos from your phone, user selected, of course, upload them, and share them on the web. So perhaps we would create this application to actually pull the user's photos, whichever ones they select from their Photos app, and then upload those on behalf of the user to the internet. What's interesting about this is that we can actually have a very simple UI that presents the user with a couple of options saying, okay, well, log in first and tell us what album you want to add these photos to. But when the user actually goes to select the photo, we could, in fact, launch an activity from an entirely different application, perhaps the photo application, and have the user select one of those photos in that other application. And this is relatively transparent. What the user sees is that they open up your app. There's a couple of options. They have to log in or do whatever. And then they click the little Choose Photo button. And it appears seamless to them in that there's another window that appears on top of that UI that they were previously interacting with. So it appears as though it's one application. But now, all of a sudden, it's a photo selector from a different application altogether. Now, this sounds kind of convoluted, but there's a great power to this in that we can generalize, then we can have this become very generalized if you wanted to include, say, Dropbox support in your application. You could actually make sure that the Dropbox application was installed and ask Dropbox to run the login activity and have the Dropbox application deal entirely with the authentication mechanism. Or perhaps you want to have your users be able to select one contact out of their contact list. Rather than fetching all of the contact information and displaying it to them, you can, in fact, ask the contact application itself to show the contact list and have the user select one of those contacts. So we have to differentiate between this idea of an application, which is what we would create and would be wholly self-contained, and what the user would actually run. When the user actually runs this application, it becomes a slightly different term that Google likes to use called a task. And the reason that it's called a task and not an application is because this task could actually run multiple applications, unbeknownst to the user. Again, in the same context whereby they start your application, and in this application, we want the user to be able to select a photo. So now we have our application running, and they see this one activity. By the way, an activity is just a screen interface to the user that the user would actually interact with. One screen is essentially one activity. So we have our own activity here. Now our application requests from the Photos app the photo selector. And so now another activity comes over and masks the one that we had below, but we have two applications running. So this is the difference between a task and an application. An application is what we are creating and is something that we are eventually going to run. But you have to realize that activities are not necessarily so specific to your application that it's only run by your application. Depending on the properties that you apply to this activity, it's possible for you to create an activity that someone else's application could then run. So again, the example here would be, say, a contacts application. Or let's say that I'm creating the new social media platform or what have you, and I actually want the user to be able to select one of their contacts from the Android device. And rather than create a contact list on my own, I can just request from the Contacts app to show that contact selector, that contact list, and have it return the data to my application. So this is just a difference in terminology, a difference in implementation. Already, this provides quite a lot of power and a lot of openness. Notice that I never said that, well, maybe I did say, but I didn't mean to say that there is the Contacts app. There's one built-in Contacts app that you always have to use. Due to this sort of open nature of Android, it's possible to create a competing Contacts app, place it on the Google Play Store, and then your users could then interface with that Contacts app, with that new Contact app instead. So rather than when my application requests a contact from the contact list, rather than go to necessarily the default application, it could provide the user with a choice. Well, I see you have multiple Contacts apps installed on your device. How, or rather, which application do you want to use to select this contact? Perhaps another example would be, let's say that you just have an activity that's very simple. It just has a URL on it. You click on that URL. You don't want to implement an entire web browser yourself, and so you figure, okay, well, now I can just launch a web browser activity from another program to show that web page to the user. You can envision a scenario where there's multiple browsers installed on this computer, or a computer, yes, but also on this device. There's multiple browsers installed on it, perhaps Chrome, perhaps Opera, maybe some others as well. And you could provide the user, and by you, I mean this happens automatically, by the user clicking on that URL and you requesting from the Google operating system, from the Android operating system, that you want to open a URL, it might realize, oh, hey, there's two programs, there's two applications that actually support this type of data. Which one do you want to use? Do you want to use Chrome or do you want to use Opera? The user can then select one of those two options and proceed to show that, that information, that web page, load that web page in whatever browser they choose. And again, it appears to be relatively seamless. It doesn't look like it swaps applications to this other web browser. It instead just loads an activity in front of the one that you are using. So there's a variety of components that can be part of your application. The activity is sort of the simplest one in the sense that this is that UI that the user is going to interface with. And what we are going to see in some code examples in a little while are just various forms of activities. But there's also different types of components that exist in an Android device as well. So there's activities, single screen with the user interface. If you want to have multiple screens, you certainly can, but that means that you're going to have multiple activities. That's not that big of a deal. It's just sort of an interesting thing to note. Another type of component that you could have is a service, which would be just a background task for long-running operations. Let's say that you want to upload some information to your web server. Let's go back to that earlier example of having this photo sharing website, and I want to have the user select a photo and be able to upload it to my website. If it's a big photo, we can run a service that uploads it in the background while the user does other things. We don't have to be bothered with it. Another example of a service might be a music player. We might have an activity that actually is the interface to that music player with play, pause, stop, volume control, forward, backward, so on and so forth. But the actual playing of the music occurs in the service, which occurs in the background, which allow you to change tasks. Again, this word tasks, which will allow you to change tasks so they could go to their web browser and continue listening to music from your same player. Now, there's a couple of other things that get a little bit more specific, but just listed in the interest of completeness. A content provider is a way, it's just sort of a standard interface for other applications to access your data. So if I actually wanted to pull some data from a common application like contacts or photos, this is separate from the idea of actually bringing up activities, but maybe there is some interface that I actually want to expose to allow other applications to access the data that my application will actually create. Content providers is the way to do that. Broadcast receivers responds to system-wide announcements. So the phone will actually broadcast to all of the applications that the screen has gone dim, or that the battery is running low, or that the Wi-Fi has been turned on or off, or a variety of other things. And even applications themselves can send broadcasts to the entire system as a whole. And you can define which, if any, of these that you're interested in actually respond to.